Great. Here we are, once again, trying to resurrect civility. Live on YouTube, just the two of us. Welcome anybody else who jumps in down the road. We are in the middle of an experiment, trying to think through a big project together online, in public, in accessible by accessible through YouTube. Um, Not yet really pushed through YouTube. We're not trying to invite an audience yet, but we're happy to be accountable to one, so to speak, when people want to join. If people want to join down the road, we may want to restart. Who knows? In a more efficient manner. It's not clear where this should go, and part of the challenge there is that we're trying to trying to articulate a fairly large thing. Trying to articulate lots of ways of looking at it. One is it is just a way of how do we build on McIntyre's work is one important lens, one important way of thinking about this. And there, what it is that was gravely culturally lost, as he describes in the beginning of After Virtue. We're trying to describe in a new way for our time, which is basically really a network of effective information processing, social information processing, in which a kind of parallel processing happens inside rich trust networks, which we're calling rich communities. They're actually rich in like-minded contact with the world, because we can parallel process, because we can trust, because we've got a common filter, we can take other people's experiences as more directly relevant to our own. At least that's the experiment that goes on. And you can parallel process, you can divide and conquer, so to speak, all sorts of different tasks. We do think we do that actually in scientific traditions. We think that people are relatively like one another in terms of what they would think if they were to conduct certain experiments. So as long as those experiments have a certain kind of repeatability among them, we take somebody else's engagement with those as evidence about what we ourselves would find. We might do that too. Parents might do that when it comes to having their kids read books, for example, books that were precious to them when they were young, lessons that were important to them, etc. But now we're getting into far more controversial territory. Two parents might share some things together, but not everybody would. So what are the limits of rich communities is a real fundamental question here. What would it be like if we aspired to build them? What would it be like if we, I'm looking for a phrase I haven't used here, thicken them up almost, or in a certain sense, generated a certain greater kind of unity amongst the members, so that there's more trust, so that there's more parallel processing, but with the risk that they are living in their own worlds in less and less contact, spending more time with like-minded people and less time with other people who see the world differently. Isn't that a great loss? Well, it is. It's a great loss, and it's in tension with being together. And so that we hope that tension can be overcome systematically by having mature members of rival communities, of different communities. If they're not rivals, they're at least different, come to know one another's ways of looking at the world through imaginative deep dives to achieve something like a second first language competency. And there we have, in a network of such information exchanges, now not within, but across different kinds of communities, you now have an algorithm at work where plurality, diversity, all are working together in principle on the same, toward the same very broad end, which is to move forward in light of as much information about our options as we possibly can gather. And we can't gather it all ourselves, but other people can gather some of it for us and let us know about it in a certain kind of way. Even if we don't, even if we don't share their view, we might deeply understand their view, where they become the judge of whether we deeply understand it. So that's the whole project that we're engaged in here. Uh, it's a complex project. It points toward, it's yet a little more complex than it seems to be already, because it points toward um, holistic accounts. What's the end point? What's the limit of inquiry? It's really answering all the questions, including setting all the directions that humankind would like to set. You could imagine if people put more in common, they might be able to achieve more in common, make greater progress in one sense of greater, seemingly greater progress, in that they're taking a deeper dive and a much broader dive, and they're organizing much more in a single account. The problem there, of course, is that it's a single account, it's their single account. But if there were rivals and they engaged in this information exchange across a network of the sort that we described, you could imagine this whole making more progress than we make now. That's the hope. So we're in the middle of that, and we use the metaphor of that whole high information flow network of rich communities being something like an infrastructure. It's a game that people are generally not playing. There generally are not teams that are greatly ambitious in this space, that are trying to put a great deal of their lives in common for a very long period of time, hold it in common across a very wide range, really comprehensive human theoretical and practical inquiry. Who does that? Right? Not even universities with their multidisciplinary investigations invest that kind of time in coming up with holistic accounts, unifying all of these various disciplines, and then putting in practice what unity is there found, and living it out together as one sort of rich community. Basically, no one does that. So strange. It's a strange enterprise, but I think it's the case, made a case earlier, and we could make it again another time, that this is one way of getting at what McIntyre says we are missing and human beings have done systematically before in ways which produced enormous kinds of fruit. Everything from the beautiful crafts of medieval art and painting, etc., where crafts are advanced for a long period of time with a common goal. But when those crafts are nested inside a whole network of other crafts, and a whole comprehensive accounts, and universities focused on putting together those comprehensive accounts and dealing with diversity amongst rival traditions, um, all of that, McIntyre says, has been done in a certain kind of way before. The question is, could we replicate some of the strengths of that approach in our modern day? We seem to be basically not trying to do that, and that's what needs to change. Why call this resurrecting? We're resurrecting something. Why call it resurrecting civility? I think because of the value of the information exchange across diverse perspectives that's laced into that algorithm. That whole possibility that we might work together on a whole, but do so diversely and do so in rich exchange with one another, that does begin to sound like a kind of civility. And it certainly stands in contrast with what we do now, which is a couple steps removed from really understanding other people. We not only don't really understand them, we basically and quite frequently insult them and accuse them of holding positions which we perfectly well know they don't hold, and that no sensible person would. And we exchange information with a flamethrower in hand, not really exchanging information, trying to burn the other source to the ground, deny its authenticity, its reality, its value, its contribution, right? It's fake. So, resurrecting civility. What is it that holds these rich accounts together? What's the mark of a rich account? What is the end point of rich inquiry in this sort of way? What to jump quickly to where we are right now? It's to say that there's a kind of narrative thread. There's a narrative thread which, on one hand, describes the various claims that are made about the present, about the world, the way it works now, about their interrelationships. There's a kind of wholeness that comes, for example, as the parts of an engine are assembled into a well-functioning whole. And the justification for the parts comes from the fact that you need a carburetor if you're going to run a fuel-air mix in this engine. Or if it's not a carburetor, it's something else, right? And that the technology advances in that way, and the parts get some justification from the whole. And in that, there's a kind of story, right? The story there is something like, this is how engines work, right? Or this is fundamentally the energy story, the mechanical limits. This is the world we have to work with. And if you want to accomplish this sort of thing, if you want to turn chemical energy into mechanical energy, you need tools like this, right? And it can be done this way. Here's the strategy. That itself is a kind of narrative. But why do it that way rather than some other way? That's another dimension of narrative. And there it's a historical claim. We've tried those other things. We've tried them, and we've tried them carefully, and we've tried them methodically. So the argument might go, so the narrative might run, and it becomes a historical narrative. And that becomes part of the story of who we are. It's part of the story of who we are is how we got here, why we are doing the things we're doing, and where we hope to go next. All of that historical dimension is also part of the narrative. So we are now at a juncture in our first, we call it something like a 30,000-foot overview of this project, what it would be like to have this project. We're at a juncture where we are considering narrative a bit, and in particular considering, and I'm sorry for running on, John, but
it's fine. Yeah.
I thought that
we're building momentum.
We're trying. Unfortunately, I'm doing it not very creatively in terms of interacting. We will get there shortly. I really
it's okay.
Shortly today, but
okay.
Just to set us up where we are now. The whole that we build doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's a whole that has got to attract people from where they are. And so all of these narratives, it turns out, are complex. They have lots of different layers. And last time we talked about the beginning, if you're a good storyteller, you can practically tell the story starting from anywhere and going to anywhere, and using the story and weaving it through. And that story becomes it's really a model. That story, I think it's fair to say, is a model. And you apply that model and you run input through it, which is some particular set of circumstances, and you get output from it. And that is a kind of meaning and direction. And so it really does become a model, a narrative does, that you're able to use as you interact with other people and more generally the broader world. So narratives are complex. You don't get them out of nowhere. If you're going to change a narrative, if you're going to bring a new narrative into play, such as really is what's trying to be accomplished here in this resurrecting civility paradigm, it's just, there's a narrative here at work. It's to say we are living in some dark ages in some ways, right? We're in the middle of dark ages, emerging from dark ages, having put together disciplinary inquiry, but really deeply missing the whole. And that's not necessary. There is a way to move forward. We've left a lot behind. We can resurrect the resources from the past and re-employ them in brand new sorts of ways in the much richer context that we're now in as a result of the fracturing that's occurred to us, that has taken place. That whole fracturing into isolated pockets, including some not so isolated, that are making tremendous progress in very particular areas. All of that is in need of a certain kind of rescue, in need of a certain kind of unification. And I think we can see the symptoms of that, and they're not hard. Not everybody sees the symptoms as symptoms of that. In fact,
Right.
almost no one sees them as symptoms of that, but they certainly see them as symptoms of something troubling, right? There's all kinds of accounts of why we can't get along with one another, for example,
Yeah.
right? But
Well,
um,
would you say that that narrative in the way we're talking about it is our a person's particular attempt at the whole, right? What story do you tell about life? Is that what we mean? Do we mean something else, right? That we have this narrative that, and people have some, whatever, a particular tradition has a narrative for the way the world works, and that's their best attempt at the whole. And maybe there isn't we don't really have a great system right now for actually incorporating all the information from different perspectives and different traditions that look at the world differently into our particular narrative. But would that be fair to say, or do you think we're talking about something different when we're talking about narrative?
let's see, what you described there are true things to say about narrative.
Yeah.
There is a lot more to say about it, and I'm no expert in it. But what I do have to say, what I've learned from reading people who are more nearly are experts in it, is it is the case that everybody has a kind of narrative. Um, Everybody's thinks of themselves is in terms of the brain works this way, really, in terms of ever more powerful models, where we increasingly, as those models develop from experience and generalization on particulars, those more powerful concepts get pushed back down and become the way over time as we see more as experts, or at least as practitioners in a certain way of looking at things with more and more experience. We now see the world the way immediately the way we used to conclude it was, something like that. So what was a conclusion is now a beginning, and the brain seems to work that way. At least this is Jeff Hawkins's case on intelligence, and not just his. So everybody's brain works this way. We construct higher level models, and those models bring together more and more. And the way we express those is in terms of story, and a story to tell, an explanation to give, etc. But
So is
not
it like a function that we just have different inputs into? Like, is it our brain's function that we just have information as the input into? And
I'm looking at it that way.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean I would never want to say just.
Yeah.
But I think that's a useful lens for looking at it. We are a black box in some way. I mean, you can look at it that way, and there's experience in, and what is it that or maybe a better way to put it is there's interaction in. That, of course, captures what people mean by experience, but I think of it a little bit differently. Experience might sound like you're a passive recipient of something that's coming your way. Now that we know how the brain works, we know that some people say it's 90% of our higher functioning neocortical functioning is dedicated to prediction.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a passive enterprise. It's the things that don't end up coming the way we expect them to come that really capture our attention and our energy. So experience isn't flooding in as if we were passive receivers. That's just not what happens. Instead, we are constructing something very, very actively. And that construction, though, is an interaction of various kinds, and the world has something to say about how we put it together. And sometimes we run into various kinds of crises, large or small, in that what we got is not at all what we expected, right? And we now have to rethink, radically rethink. It could be, well, we could go down that rabbit hole if we wanted to. There's all kinds of rethinking, right, that happens. And some of it is deep, moral, personal, evaluative, reflective, reconsideration of who we are and what we stand for, et cetera. And others is just, do I really understand how this thing works, right? Maybe I don't.
Mhm.
And it could be mechanical rethinking, right? Rethinking a physical problem or how a device works. All of that is kinds of rethinking. But all of that has got narrative, I'd say. You can understand it as narrative on top. Narrative is sort of the phrase we use for the models that, and there's something interesting about our models. We can't take everything in at once. We have to take it in bit by bit by bit,
Mhm.
which is, there's something interesting about consciousness and about the way the brain works here. There's a ton of stuff we can take in all at once. I mean, we can see two hands, we can understand the conversation, we interact in pretty complex sort of ways all at once, as if it were, right? It's seemingly all at once anyway,
Mhm.
right? It's a very powerful, multi-functional um, experience um, that we're engaged in seamlessly, it seems sometimes. But then there are things that simply are not present yet, and they're
Mhm.
yet to be. They might be right in front of us, and we just haven't attended to them yet.
Mhm.
Or maybe they, in some other sense, we never could have attended to them yet, right? Something, they're more
Yep.
radical, come to us from further outside. Um, that All of that gives us some kind of sense that turns experience into story,
Yeah.
because a story runs along. It's got a line. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. It runs in space and time. If we push this really hard, we could say that. Well, let's not push it really hard into consciousness and conscious realism, but
Mhm.
we could run down that road, and we've run down it before a little bit, and we'll run down it some more in the future.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe there's something interesting about the nature of consciousness here, and maybe there's a kind of limited perspective that we have. And this is something I think is quite valuable. We ourselves can limit our own perspectives. We can concentrate from a certain point of view, for example. We know these other things are being left out of consideration, and we do so intentionally sometimes or unintentionally, very, very frequently. But nonetheless, we leave them out, and we are particularly focused. And then move on to another, there's a good question as to whether that moving on in space and time is related to the expansion of the particularity of our focus,
Mm.
right? It would take sequence, right? Sequence is sort of built in to the movement from the more particular, or from some particular to less particular, or to new particular, right? There's
Yeah.
some all that. There's a kind of movement, and there's a kind of order in there. Um, anyway, this is why we say narrative and not just experience. Our
Yep.
experience is ordered, and surprisingly ordered, sequentially ordered. It seems to be, and we put that together, and that order stays a part. It stays an element of, a feature of, I should say, right? Are the models that we have. These are models about how things operate in time in some sort of order. So yeah, so these are big. It's everything I know about the world. They are multiplex. I have more than one of them. I don't necessarily know how my narrative over here plays with my narrative over here. I may never have thought about how these things come together, um, Or the more reflective I am and the longer I live, maybe I start to notice analogies between various areas, for example, and say maybe there's some larger whole, right, that's being reflected that's being played out between these analogs that are working out in various different areas of experience. Wild, right? And maybe that's what the brain is constantly doing, constantly ordering in that way. But they need not be complete. These stories are not complete, right? They're multiplex, and yet we weave them together, especially when called to weave them together. When someone pushes you and say, "Wait, how can you say that and do that here when over here you insisted on this?" Right? And that all of a sudden catches me unawares, or reminds me that I'm dishonest, right? Because I might have quite well known that I was doing that and doing it intentionally, and don't care, right? I'm manipulating the facts, not trying to come up with a consistent story that I shared other people. Maybe I'm disingenuous. I'm trying not to be that, of course, but a person might be. Okay, so let's jump. Yeah, here's where we are. I want to make a quick, efficient jump here. That was not at all efficient. It had other virtues though. But now let's take on the virtue of efficiency here.
Right.
These various narratives over various areas that can be sewed together in various ways. Some of them don't seem to. Some of them sync together well, and some of them seem to come together. You could say this, some reinforce one another, to use the wave pattern analogy, right? Some of them reinforce, and some of them do precisely the opposite. They tend to cancel one another, or they cause some difficulty as we try to put the two of them together. So nobody can build a great big story, and nobody can build a great big resurrecting civility, high information flow network of rich community paradigm and build a single account of the world that would rest in that infrastructure, on that paradigm, and thus be a competitor, right, in what should be a friendly competition, right, in which the competition is essential, right, to bring different. It's absolutely essential. It's essential because of the nature of human beings. We need to process information socially. We need to do it among like-minded people, and that like-mindedness is never enough. It's useful, it's essential, but it's not the end of the story. And we need to become like-minded with very differently minded people. We need to be able to exchange information with them and benefit from them. In that process, we have to take into account the leading narrative fragments, to use that language, the leading narrative fragments that are occupying our attention as we try and build some new whole. We don't build it out of nothing. We build it out of the pieces we have. And some of those pieces don't play well with, or don't seem to play so well with a sort of a meta narrative, a master narrative that could include it. And some of them have to be reconceived so that they do, if they're going to play well in a coherent, consistent, shareable, actionable master narrative. The various pieces that have really got a hold on us have got to be conceived in such a way that they fit in that space. And what that means for each person is different. But what it surely means, if we're going to do this at scale and get humankind to build, to move toward richer communities, and richer communities in the right kind of contact with one another, if we're going to move in that direction, we're going to have something to say about the big piece the large scale sub narratives if I can invent that term.
Yeah.
Sub in the sense that they could be included in some larger piece, right? So what's it like to be a citizen? What's it like to be an employee? What's it like to be a family member? What's it like to be, an athlete? There are stories to tell in those areas, and I just grabbed almost random four, although those are obviously quite important ones. Probably there are others I'm really leaving out. And there are different things to say in those spaces, in each of those spaces. What's it like to be a family member? What's it like to be a member of this family? Who is this family anyway, right? There are many different stories that could be told, competing stories that could be told in that space. Maybe those competing stories could be brought together, and maybe a family could come to understand itself with a certain kind of unity and familiarity. And so they have something to say about what it's like to be a member of this family. But what's that got to do with being a citizen? Or what's it got to do with being an athlete? Or what's it got to do with being an inquirer or a learner, right? Or all kinds of different things we could go on to ask. So, good questions. And in order to illustrate that process, in order to build a single candidate, what's it like to look at the whole world from a single set of lenses and to systematically invite people to take on those lenses and look at the world together out of those lenses, out of those common lenses? To even illustrate that project, you're going to have something to say about some of these big alternatives. And they're going to be socially big if you're going to do this at scale. So, what are some of the socially big sub narratives? And certainly some of them are nationalistic narratives, and certainly some of them are religious narratives.
Mm-hmm.
There are ethnic narratives, racial, who knows, right? Lots and lots to be explored in this space. But as we've talked about, I'm sort of setting it up more fully, but we need to come to grips. If we're going to build communities in the United States, you've got to have American narrative or sub narratives somehow included in that conversation. What are we doing? Are we leaving our allegiance to our nation? Did we ever have any? Should we ever had any? If we do, and there's a kind of patriotism that bites hard and that we don't want to let go of, if there's something to being an American or a U.S. citizen that confers that invites you into certain rights and responsibilities and confirms a certain kind of affinity with a tradition of inquiry that has really learned some things and encoded some things, found some things to be self-evident and encoded them in a constitutional order, right? That if we're going to stay aligned with that, we have to have something to say about it as we construct an alternative, larger meta narrative. And the same thing is true if there's a religious dimension, right? And so you can only start where you are. You don't really know other people's narratives. And so I'm an American. I've been a Christian all my conscious life, more or less. And so those are surely two narratives, sub narratives, unless they're more than sub narratives, but they seem to be sub narratives. I don't think either one of them really likes that place, wouldn't love that phrase, right? As if there's something bigger and more important than that. That's particularly true in religious contexts. People would think you're whittling it down. You're somehow missing the point of this larger thing. Well, maybe.
Right.
So let's
God,
see.
country, Notre Dame.
Exactly. Nice. All right. So let's start down that road a little bit. And I wanted to introduce a few things here. Number one, I think that narratives, this ought not to be an intellectual exercise. These ought to be the real questions that we actually really have. And not just you and I, and not just John, and not just any other particular persons who come into the conversation here. But let's imagine our family. to start beyond the individual level. And let's start with just a little bit of family history, because what I want to do is visit these Christian and American narratives from a familial, grounded point of view, or something like that. I didn't say that well, but something like that.
Yeah.
So let me tell you about George Alcock. George Alcock was a deacon who came over in 1630 on Winthrop's set of ships. That set of ships is actually listed over here, the Winthrop fleet. This is in 1630. Most of these ships are not very famous. The Mayflower is on this list. It's quite famous. But this should not be confused with the Mayflower voyage to the same region 10 years earlier. That's roughly when the Mayflower that we think of in association with Plymouth, right?
Yeah.
The famous rock, etc. That's about 10 years earlier. So this was in that same time of life, and a lot of these people were same families, etc. But this was pretty far down the road, yet 10 years down the road, where a larger group of people came over. There were many hundreds of people. This is from an entire list of all those people. I think there's about 700 that came on this what came to be known as the Winthrop fleet. I don't know the origin of that phrase, but certainly it might have come later, because the first governor of Massachusetts was on that fleet. And George Alcock was on that fleet. Here he is. And here he is with his wife, Alcock, Mrs., and the rest of her disappears below the floorboards there. But I went that far because I wanted to point out that she's the sister of Reverend Thomas Hooker. Thomas Hooker is the person who in the state of Connecticut is known as the founder of the state of Connecticut, at least in some circles. So this was roughly that time, and George Alcock was married into that family. Thomas Hooker was a witness of the will when George Alcock died, and I think later went to Connecticut. So he's a deacon. And it turns out he's also, and now let me see if I can very quickly jump this out to front. Sorry, I ran out of room here. Bring to front. There we go. I just wanted to throw all these pieces in one. This George Alcock was your 12th great grandfather, I think. This I know. This is our common ancestor, James Grant Loughran, my father, your grandfather. And this line runs surely through here. I mean, we've got all kinds of records for that. And I only don't remember how good these connections are. I dimly recall that they're often asserted by people who are also descended, say, from this far back, when the trees branch out from the Leatherwoods. There's a lot of assertion that this is the right connection, but it gets harder and harder when the records get thinner and thinner. And just the chances of making zero mistakes as you go back through multiple steps, right? We all know how to propagate that error.
Yeah.
If you have a 5% error on any of these and you're 95%, pretty soon you're certainly wrong, right?
Right.
Run through a complex, almost certainly wrong. But anyway, with all that said, there's a little bit of family connection here. And I wanted to throw that out because I wanted to bring back, I wanted to start with George Alcock and the church he was part of. This church, which is the first church in Roxbury, that's in Boston, and it was founded in 1630. Why it's called the first meeting house of 1632? It could be it had another name before that, and I think that might be right. I think actually they built a congregation in relationship with another congregation until the second one could get on its feet, something like that. It was sort of nurtured into existence, which is why sometimes it's said to be 1630 it was founded, other times 1632. Here are a list of the early deacons in that church, and George Alcock is on that list, and so is this other guy, Mr. William Park. And here is that same section. You can see that phrasing captured here, if
Mm-hmm.
a little bit off to the side. This comes from a video. It's a video that I was watching with my wife in a show called Finding Your Roots.
Mm.
And I've got a little section of Finding Your Roots, and this is a genealogical show in which this Harvard scholar interviews a variety of people. And the person he was interviewing this time was Rick Warren. And it turns out, Pastor Rick Warren, Purpose Driven Life, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that he was pointing out to him that William Park was actually his ancestor, and that he has remarkably deep roots, which he didn't know about in the United States. Very deep roots, and very deep roots in the church. And we're about to see him as he, in a minute and 30 seconds, as he deals with that news and reflects on it. So I should say before we dive into this, because I won't forget it otherwise, he came and was part of a forum at Notre Dame. Rick Warren did. And I stayed afterwards because when I saw this, by the way, I had seen this show before that forum, and I had seen this name show up on the screen, and I had seen this other name, George Alcock. And I said, you got to be kidding me. That's my 11th great grandfather, I think, or thereaughts, because I had done this little bit of research. So I went up to him after his show, Lisa and I did, and said, hey, you had this ancestor here, and I think so do I. And he gave me a huge hug, or cousin, whatever he said. Very nice guy, and we liked him a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But he's got a story to tell. And he's dealing with these meta narratives, and he's dealing with both a Christian and an American meta narrative. And this is a very nice place to see it at work. So let's give this a listen.
Explains why he and his fellow Puritans, including Rick's 9th great grandfather, William Park, should leave civilized England to move to the wilderness of the New World. One of them was to raise a bulwark against the kingdom of Antichrist, which the Jesuits labor to raise in all parts of the world. Hilarious. That is really funny. All other churches of Europe are brought to desolation, and our sins, which the Lord begins already to frown upon us. And who knows but that God hath provided of this place to be a refuge for many whom he means to save. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. That is amazing. Wow. Do you think that your ancestors' dream, as Winter expressed it in what you just read, has come true? Well, I think that their desire to build a, quote, Christian utopia has not come true. And I think that's unrealistic. I think God does, as I read scripture, God doesn't intend for us to have heaven on earth. Heaven is heaven and earth is earth. But the benefit and the blessing of having that kind of foundation created a nation that is unlike any other in the world in terms of the commitment to justice, the commitment to truth, the commitment to love. No nation is as generous as America. None. Nobody even comes close.
There's just a little bit of the little clip. You can, if you want to see the rest of the whole story, it's searchable. You can find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
So what you think when you saw that? I've had a chance to think about it for a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. What do I think about that? Yeah, I mean, clearly he has a story. Yeah. I don't know. I think there's a lot of, I don't know. I guess it says something about how he views the Christian narrative, certainly. given his view on a Christian utopia. I mean, I think that was says something about his view of Christianity and its goals. And I think it also shows he thinks very highly of America and what America stands for in the world and what its its success in achieving parts of that, some of parts of its, maybe some of what people were excited about coming and starting a new nation as a Christian utopia, that being seeking justice and truth and being generous, but that never being fully realized. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's what I don't know.
No, that's good start. Just looking to start grappling with it a little bit. There are two stories he's telling here, right? He's telling a story about how he reads scripture, for example, which doesn't have, which could be told without any reference, certainly before, right? There was any reference to anything we'd call American life. It's an independent story in a way. It's a story of creation. It's a story in which there's a God, there's a heaven, a place where God lives. It's not here. God apparently seems to have some intention for here, but not to make it heaven. Right? That's a different deal. And there's in general a flow and a favorable light cast on the truth-seeking, the justice-seeking, the generous, right? All of that, he seems to imply, right, is sort of the fruit of the Christian life. And it characterizes our nation. And our nation wouldn't be the same. We're exceptional as an American nation, to use the phrase that's often used, right? American exceptionalism. This is a very nice, deeply instinctive articulation of American exceptionalism, right?
Yeah.
There's no nation like us, no nation so generous, so truth-seeking. Certainly no nation so generous, not even close. And the superlatives he wrapped around justice-seeking and truth-seeking seems to me to be that he thinks that we're exceptional in those ways too, right? No nation comes so close, although I don't want to put more words in his mouth than he actually put. And that seems to be the fruit of the Christian life, the fruit of our Christian foundings, Christian foundations. You oftentimes hear American is a Christian nation. You'd be surprised if he would go so far, or put it this way, somebody who thought that American were a Christian nation might say the kinds of things he just said. So there are a couple of narratives here, and we know them well, and they are united in his mind. There is a kind of harmony between these various accounts, right? We live in an exceptional nation. You might think we are, I mean, what are we? Are we salvation? Are we the world's salvation? He wouldn't say that, right? I mean, I'm going beyond what he said here. Probably he wouldn't say that, except insofar as we've received, right, from our Savior, the Christian story would say, these really good-hearted foundational commitments and foundational gifts, right? And it's insofar as those gifts flow out into the world that maybe God is accomplishing a certain kind of salvation of the world through America. All of that is cast in a, hold on, I don't mean to go too far here. We're not trying to make heaven out of this earth, right? Or whether we're trying to, we don't expect to, right? This is not where heaven is, and this is not where we will end up. We're going to end up there, somewhere else than here. And that's apparently, he didn't speak of that as if that were a bad thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Sorry, you only get to play here a while, and then you fall off and you go somewhere dank and miserable, right? That's not the way he expressed it or thinks about it, or anybody thinks about it practically, right? In the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
So I think this is a nice example of um, a couple of meta narratives. I shouldn't call them meta narratives, so they are. Every narrative, insofar as it contains some others, is sort of higher. It's beyond those others, right?
Mhm.
Contains them in some way. So yeah, there's a kind of there's a couple of narratives here, and they're both pretty big narratives, and they play together nicely. They're harmonized, but they're harmonized in particular versions.
Mhm.
Very particular version of Christianity. Um, I think you and I both heard slightly different versions, right? That versions in which God's intent is not to take us somewhere else.
Mhm.
Heaven is not the ultimate destination for which this is just a stage,
Mhm.
as if it doesn't matter. Instead, there's a kind of a cosmic salvation that God is at work in, work on. That there's that those themes can produce maybe a complementary or maybe a deeply different account of the Christian life
Mhm.
than his. And the same thing is true with his American account, right?
Yeah.
Not everybody would see it necessarily as so wonderful.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and there's a marriage between the two from the beginning.
Yeah.
In the country. So it's America is springing from that Christian source. You know, it's an offshoot of that, and the best one yet.
Yeah. So it'd be great to bring some folks in to continue the narrative. Folks, maybe it could be Rick Warren, or it could be, my guess is it could be James Dobson. I don't know if you know him, but
I've heard the name.
he's the founder of Focus on the Family.
Oh, yeah.
And Focus on the Family is also connected to another organization, the name of which often gets mentioned and is currently escaping me. But I'll think about that. I'll pop that later too. But these are pretty conservative evangelical, or put it this way, they're said to be pretty conservative evangelical organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Dobson would say things in raising parent in his contributions to parenting. He would say things like the real question is, look, all I really want is I just want to see you there. I'm just trying to get you there, where there is heaven,
Mm-hmm.
your eternal salvation. And that's what it's really all about. That's the central question, the defining question. Um, and it does involve not this life.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't involve, I shouldn't say, I don't want to put words in his mouth. He's very capable of putting his own words in his mouth. But anyway, I do think that people could continue that story, and they could look back and we could ask them, what's going on now? And they would have some resources for giving an account of what's going on now in a nation. What's
Mm-hmm.
what's going on now in say under this presidency, in under with our current constitutional challenges, with our um, with our current economic international relations, with our current factioning, uh,
Mm-hmm.
all of that. What do you think is happening? We we might say to such a person, and we might invite them to comment. And it's interesting to see what they would have to do. I mean, I wonder if you can put that hat on.
Yeah.
What do you suppose they might say?
What do I suppose they might say to
About our
that,
current moment?
about our current moment?
Yeah, what's happening in 2020 from the point of view of American exceptionalism and
Yeah.
Christian nation, right? A foundation of a Christian nation. What's happening?
Yeah. Well, I would say, putting that hat on, that the America is currently under attack from the forces of secularization, and uh, um, socialism and or slash Marxism, that has its roots in um, basically the postmodern movement of the, 50s and 60s, and the counterculture in the 60s. And that movement has been infiltrating our academia and our institutions, and has basically succeeded in reframing the founding of our country as this, as pretty well exemplified in the 1619 Project in the New York Times, and has reframed the history of our country in a unfair way, in order to cast aspersions on the principles and the Christian foundation that we were founded upon. And um, and what we're seeing now in the current era with Donald Trump coming to the presidency is the clearest indication yet of the division in our country that those people are causing due to their hatred and desire to destroy the country and rebuild something new from the foundation up. And the reason Trump is in power is because he was the only person willing to say, call out the media and the intelligentsia of the country for their attempt to undermine what true patriots understand about this country, which is the greatness of its foundations and the principles and the people who founded the country, and the prosperity that it provides. That's probably what how I would say they would say it.
This is great. Would you add to that the essential Christian heritage that that America was founded on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is precisely what's being threatened, and it ought to be defended.
Mm-hmm.
And it's um, and in a certain way, and here I have in mind something that I could imagine James Dobson saying.
Mm-hmm.
Trump is our last best hope.
Mm-hmm.
Never say never, never discount the power of God. But
mm-hmm.
when I say our last, I don't mean there would be all kinds of hemming and hawing about what's meant about that. But
Mm-hmm.
a very, very big sort of millennial, maybe even cosmic sort of way, right? All shit would hit the fan. It would be a terrible outcome, right? If we had the forces of, if we had those very forces that you were describing take the helm. And thus, like him or not, God has raised him up. I think that is a very, I think there's a lot of that, and it explains why there's so much evangelical allegiance.
Mm-hmm.
And he may be, he's a flawed human being like all of us are, but God stuck that flawed human being right in the lion's jaws, to hold open the lion's jaws as they sought to close on the Christian American project.
Yeah.
And this ought to be, then we ought to be redoubling. This ought to be, you would think those folks would say, this ought to be a great awakening. We would need a great awakening. Although I don't actually know of such a movement, but this is what they ought to say. a great revolution, you do hear a little bit of that. This will be there'll be somehow our order is going to crumble, and out of that order is going to have to be refounded various expressions of Christian. I could call it Christian community. That's not so much the word they use. Christian society, I think, is it might be a better word. Although there are people who might say Christian community in that space. And let's just hope that these days are short. I'm thinking of Jesus's remarks, maybe about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? Or maybe other people's interpretations about the end of the world, right? They have views of apocalyptic literature, but you pray that these times go fast, because it's really going to be difficult, right? You can imagine that very sort of stance being taken in the face of change.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think something that comes to mind now is thinking about, I mean, what is the source of, what is the source of our rights in the Western sense? And I think from the Christian American foundation, it would be that man and women were made in the image of God. And that's the source of human value. And
wonderful.
If the forces of secularization strip that away, then who knows what could happen? Things cease to make sense.
Yeah. You know that the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture has a fall conference series that they've had for 20 something years now. And 2 years ago, and if I got my dates right, if I'm wrong, somebody will forgive me, but I believe it was in 2018, the conference theme was higher powers. And that's a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Or put it this way, it's so generic that it could have been from all various sources, but they really focused on Solzhenitsyn's use of that concept of higher powers. And the very theme of the conference was something like you've just articulated, that our very moral foundations are, what's the word? Are we adrift? Have they been cut? Are they not unmoored is good? Are they generally unrecognized and really in danger of being lost to public awareness? Something like that. And that this is a grave problem. This is a real big problem. Because God is the source of all these things. These are how I wish I could remember the phrasing from Solzhenitsyn, but of course it's lengthy and beautiful. That I do remember, but yeah. Somehow there's a and a lot of Americans would and a lot of Americans there, I think, at this conference did. I could be wrong about this, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of Americans resonated with that cry for return to awareness, or on the optimistic side, and bemoaning the loss on the pessimistic side of an awareness of the essential grounding of all of value, all of truth in higher powers, in God, right? Fundamentally. And that's right. So that's, if you were a constitutional scholar and you're trying to do law, that's sort of the way, you know, a Christian lawyer might continue the conversation just along the lines that you added to the mix at the very end, and might use language like that. In fact, that Christian lawyer was probably at that conference. I mean, it's that it wouldn't have to be, but probably knows about it, right? And the people they read were probably there. So, yeah. So I outlined a paper for that conference. I actually didn't know about it until I simply missed it. I was asleep at the switch. Didn't catch the submission deadline or the conference theme at all. I think it came in my inbox, and I think I just checked it off without paying attention. I'm surprised I missed it, because it's traditionally been pretty important to me, that conference. But I didn't go. But I wrote something anyway, or at least I outlined something. That's what I did. I outlined something, thinking I would send it in any case, but I ended up not writing it, and I ended up not writing it because the things that I had to say were, I think, too counter to that narrative on too many points all at once. And I think it's worth just illustrating the point here for a minute or two. When it comes to values, and when it comes to the rootedness of values in the created order, and a created order that's articulated in terms of a Christian account of the world, you might think there's just one way to do that, or that there are some things that would be unquestioned. And I think that that's not true. There are multiple ways to do it, and radically different. And I think that we are on the verge of a revolution, in a philosophical revolution, a scientific revolution, a religious revolution, that gets at those, that gets at that story, that large narrative concerning faith and values, if you can just to grab it by two hooks, right? I think I think there's a reading of McIntyre, actually, and I think there's a reading of Scripture, and I think that there's a reading of the natural law tradition that basically gets done in a radically different way what people in that tradition at that higher powers conference were all looking for. But they have to give up a bunch of stuff all at once. They would, for example, I mean, if Rick Warren were there, I'm not saying he would be, but if someone who had Rick Warren's, and here I don't mean to speak at all disrespectfully of this way of looking at things. I held it, I think it's fair to say I grew up on it myself. And although it's complicated with Catholics, because Catholics have got this a lot of resources to appeal to. Yeah, the short version of that is a lot of tradition and not just an interpretation of Scripture of a certain kind. So they may have more text to appeal to, but I think it's, let's see, where's I going with that? Yeah, I sort of grew up, and I say sort of because of that complex relationship with tradition, sort of grew up with that two-story universe in mind. And I think Catholics generally have. And I also think that it is, when you read, for example, the scriptural exegesis of N.T. Wright, and read other of the council fathers, I should say, you read some of the Second Vatican Council fathers. I don't mean to imply that Wright was one, but other scripture scholars whose work was reflected in the theological reflection of the council. You find it's not so simple. And I think I used the phrase, I know I did here before, that John Paul II uses it in Crossing the Threshold of Hope. It must be admitted that that the cosmological eschatology, or the cosmological, the idea that all of the cosmos is saved, is only faintly present in traditional preaching, that phrase.
Yeah.
But his assertion is it is actually present in traditional preaching. You can find it. You can find it in scripture, and it's been radically ignored. And in part, it's been radically ignored to make this a kind of revolution of Christian exegesis and a Christian worldview, to make it almost so short as to make it a bumper sticker. Add to that faint presence add to the fact that it was only faintly present a deep misinterpretation of apocalyptic literature. This is a point N.T. Wright makes and runs with hard, right? So that apocalyptic literature is taken literally, deeply misunderstood, so that Jesus's discussion about the fall of Jerusalem, for example, is interpreted as being about the end of the world, because the language of the sort of sky is falling language, to use an apocalyptic phrase from our own time, right? That nobody takes very seriously because it's Chicken Little, right? that basically that metaphor, right, for referring to the end of the world is another phrase we use, right? It's practically the end of the world as we know it, right, or something like that. That language was used, but was not used in that literal sort of way. And Jesus was just misunderstood by many generations of scripture scholars. And on N.T. Wright's account, this was simply that was not the worldview of the Old Testament and the people of God, to cite the title of his first book. It was, this single world was the world, and language about heaven. And we could go into lots of detail, but you've heard some of this in your pass through Trinity School, if nowhere else, right? Because it's woven in the scripture curriculum there. But that take that faint presence and drown it with apocalyptic misreading of scripture, and you get the two-story universe exegesis, even in Catholic thought. And that is, but that is all by itself a really fundamental question. If you give up that two-story universe, what on earth else are you giving up? How do you reinterpret what's happening here? How do you reinterpret the incarnation?
Yeah. Where
did Jesus come from? Where is he going to? What is Christ? And now take also the second barrel of Wright's same shotgun, right? Take the understanding of Christ that's articulated in his Jesus and the Victory of God, second great work in that series. And the incarnation gets radically reinterpreted. And the incarnation was not a one-time event that took place in Bethlehem. right? Or wherever they were when Jesus was first enunciated, right? Nazareth.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't just take place there. Um, and it's taking place all the time. And Christ is fully present, fully alive. We are. We have the whole Spirit of God. You are Christ. I am Christ. We are Christ more brightly together than any of us are separately. But this is where God lives. This is where God dwells. This is the new heaven and the new earth coming together, right? Becoming more and more plain, more and more manifest. And what does that do to the idea of higher powers being the source of value? What happens when the very person who's making judgments next to you is Christ, is one, right? The very second person of the Trinity. And if you bother saying these things, you'd be run out of town, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd be run out of town by fairly traditional Christian thinkers. You'd plainly be heretical.
Mm-hmm.
They would cite a whole series of things that have been said in the past to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, those things continue to be said, and they were said by the Council Fathers throughout, not just the last council, but particularly the Eastern Fathers, more so.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reading of Alistair McIntyre, and I'll cut to the chase, and you already know it, in which value comes from the choices of every single individual. There is no outside of your choices. Your choices are definitive insofar as they are well informed.
Mm.
And it's information that improves choices. And the end point of human rational thought, including our practical rational thought, or our identification of what we ought to pursue and why. The end point of all of that is the informed decision, the informed reaction. That information has to take place, has to be embodied socially, because we can't get all the information by ourselves. But the algorithm that I've attributed to McIntyre, that runs its way through this whole network of interacting communities, that algorithm delivers what it is that people really want. And it's precisely because they really want it. It's precisely because they really choose it that it is good.
Mm.
And the same thing is true with what they think is true, not just in that domain with regard to value, the truth about their assertions of value, but truth about their assertions of everything else as well. And the higher powers are right here.
Hmm.
And that is a radically different interpretation of the Christian life, Christian metaphysics, Christian epistemology, all using the same language, all affirming the same sorts of things, but it would have been run out of town first as unentertained, as unheard of, as unaccepted.
Hmm.
But there is a way to make the case, if nothing else, to make the case persuasively is one thing. To articulate that there is a second case to be made that reinterprets a lot of different things: how you interpret Scripture, how you interpret our experience, our social structure, how you interpret God's relationship to human beings, where we come from, the relationship between the natural order and the created order, all of those things are reinterpreted.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this would, let's see. Like you, I think I'm pretty familiar with both of those narratives. I guess, and maybe this is something I need to think through more carefully. Once, given that second one you articulated, describing what N.T. Wright's sort of reinterpretation, it becomes difficult for me to understand why, like, if there isn't some separate place, then why is that stuff actually important?
Which,
right? Why is God's relationship? Why is this intersection of God, of heaven and earth? Why is Christ being in you and me? Why are those things? Why is that information important with regards to how we should make choices in the world?
right, because why? Because the same thing happens to us, or God knows maybe nothing happens to us, or what the hell happens to us. But in any case, isn't it because of something that ought to happen to us if we get it right,
Yeah,
that it makes a difference whether we get it right?
right.
Are following you line
I think so.
some way?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. So, what, if just more information is what makes our choices better, right? And
Generally improves them.
right? And the reason that matters, like the reason we care about, like, if individuals making decisions as informed decisions as possible, right? The reason there is no need for a higher power to be involved there is because Christ is in that person.
There is a higher power involved. It's just not where you were looking. Right.
So I guess either I don't understand the difference between the two views once you actually follow them to their logical conclusions,
Yep.
or I don't understand the necessity for the second view, if there actually is a difference in the conclusions that you come to at the end.
Nice. Yeah.
So that, I guess that's sort of, I guess that's my reaction to hearing those two separate narratives.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, you've thrown down the gauntlet really well, because I think those are two dimensions of the rhetorical exercise that's got to be accomplished. The rhetorical challenge, the rhetorical another way to put it, because you can put everything this way, is it's the rhetorical computation, right? It's what needs to be solved from a computing point of view, right? It's the problem needing to be solved. How do you move a person who has either from an existing set of motives and an existing set of commitments, how do you bring them into a transformed set of commitments? How is that new set of commitments different? Why is that new set of commitments better? What does it do with the commitments that were made prior to the transformation? And are those commitments now, are you false to those commitments? Do you abandon the ends that you were pursuing before, or are they subsumed over here in some way? If they're subsumed, what's the difference, right? If are they really just the same, or what's new, right? What's plainly new, and does the recognition of that plainly new, that at the same time brings with it the heart of the plainly old, right? No one's going to turn their back on all the purposes that they understood. Somehow those purposes have got to be represented, now accomplishable, even more accomplishable, and the reason why the transformation was needed revealed at the same time. So
Yep.
there's a motivational piece and there's an intellectual piece, and that's wrongly put. It's all intellectual. There's a theoretical and a practical piece. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Right. And the theoretical is sort of like, what on earth is the difference, and how do I? It was sort of it was a motivationless exercise, right? Of what's in any case the difference between these views, because you use a lot of the same words, right? You've got some of the same concepts. How are these different? That's an intellectual question. But then there's this, and it's an important intellectual question. Otherwise, you're wasting your damn time thinking about it practically, right? I mean, who wants to do that? I mean, we're trying to get it right here. And there's a kind of motivation that's present in just the pursuit of illumination, of understanding, etc. But there's more than that, right? That's not the only thing to pursue. There's all kinds of goods, important motivations, and there is also a kind of challenge at that level. All right. So this shouldn't be a surprise to us if inquiry is holistic, combined, interchangeably, intertwinedly, theoretical and practical at the large meta narrative level, the holistic narrative level. Okay. That's good. And we could start throwing some pieces down, but it probably doesn't do justice. It might be worth throwing one down just by way of illustration, and leave it at that for now, because we need to come back to that, and it's not going to be a short order. You've described quite a turn that has to be taken there, right? There's a lot of mapping of concepts, and there's a lot of unfolding of motivations, right? Which requires deep immersion and sort of storytelling. And you have to feel why this is different than that. You have to feel why you're sure as hell going to do this, right? Because now you see that, right? And that doesn't come quickly, and it doesn't just come once.
So here, let me just say, the transformation. I think this is. I just want to sort of get clear in my own head what I mean. That transformation of the Christian narrative that you described. So here's what's unclear to me. So what is motivating that transformation? So why does the story need to be transformed in that way? Why is the old story, or maybe the more commonly understood story, where does it fall short, and how does this new story answer those or fill in those gaps? And so what's the goal? And so why is that necessary, right? So so obviously there's some sort of gap there. But in looking to fill that gap, I wonder, let's see. I wonder if the essential that we're holding on to pieces from the old story to answer these questions that aren't actually essential. We're just holding on to them because they are our tradition. That makes sense. Where
Yeah, I do.
Because we have these questions we can't answer with our old model, we are trying to reframe our old model and get it to work in order to answer these questions that we need answered.
So look how I titled the start of this second plunge in narrative in a row here. I called it Competition, Subversion, and Transformation, right? Because what you just did there really is point to the threat of subversion, because it could be the reason you were in that old case, right, is you just had a bunch of crap in there you did not need, right? What you really needed is to let go of that old story and buy into a new one.
Yeah.
Right. And don't shout. Why should you be shackled to certain kinds of concepts, certain kinds of solutions? Maybe you should let those go, right? In order to solve the real problems that you really have.
Yeah.
And so there's a threat of subversion in the encounter.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, one might hope for, but not really hope for. One ought not really to hope for. One ought to be perhaps agnostic, right, as to whether your old tradition is subverted or transformed. What I mean by transformed is it's still there. It's even better than it was before,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it turns out there were there were riches in that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you've uncovered them and reconfigured them and re-empowered them. And now you're off to the races like you weren't before. There's a kind of transformation, and that's not subversion.
Yeah.
Right. But, and I'd say you might hope for that, but you actually only hope for it if you're unduly emotionally tied to that tradition you used to hold on to. You maybe you ought to be willing to get rid of it. Now, for all the reasons that we argued for the various, for the power of tradition to amass and to pass on information through non-cognitive formation, you might want to be cautious about your happy resistance or happy rejection, right, of your tradition, because you might want to be careful you're not throwing out some information in the bathwater there, right? To mix my metaphors really bad. Baby in the bathwater and information baby.
Mm-hmm.
That's a possibility, but that's not and it gets worse if you know that culture can pass on information non-cognitively through emotional formation.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it's in your emotional reaction to this that people's experience and judgment is captured and transformed. And it's kind of like, it turns out that emotion you have is kind of like a stake pounded into the side of the mountain that enables you to climb right past that point. Right? It's an easy climb now. And you might say, I don't want easy climbs. Maybe not, but be careful you don't throw that stake out at the wrong time. Because there could have been a lot riding on that stake.
Right.
Something like that. I'm really
right.
something my here. But
maybe, I mean, revolutions are destructive.
They are destructive, and they might destroy. I mean, you could imagine the revolution McIntyre talks about at the start of After Virtue, right? That revolution throws out craft. It throws out culture, and what's left is a heap, unassembled in a cultural whole, a mere heap, to use the language of Aristotle, right? And no substance. no craft.
Mm.
Yeah, so there's danger there. That's right. So I'm going to throw maybe one piece in, if it would be useful, or we could just wait. I could give you one example of a reason why make this transformation, and it would be an unexpected one, and it would be one for you to chew on, and it would give you some idea for what's at stake in the transition from one paradigm to another.
Okay.
And I think I can do it very quickly.
Okay.
In a very short phrase. God is not an asshole.
Mm.
That's a phrase that I've been chewing on that has got a lot of rhetorical power. Now, if I did send you actually, the interview with 11 evangelicals. Did I send you that? And why the ex-evangelical movement? Did I send you that little piece? Maybe not.
It's not ringing any bells for me.
I'll send it to you, but I'll tell you that a bunch of them, they put it very well. Look, I just don't understand how. One woman put it delightfully. Look, I can forgive all kinds of people. Why can't God? Why instead does he cook up a fricassee, right, in which he's going to consciously pound them into misery for all eternity? Or he's going to allow it, or pick your theodicy. That's what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a very strong instinct here, right? That something about that is wrong. And it's maybe the threat of being burned at the stake yourself that kept so many people from saying so. You end up sounding like a heretic if you push back too hard at that heaven and hell theodicy. So you bend over backwards to try to accommodate it. But at some point, if the God you worship is an asshole, so are you. Another phrase I really like in this neighborhood. You're responsible for letting come in through I'm searching for a metaphor I don't have. You're responsible for importing with your account of God and the whole theodicy and the whole account that you take and that you accept. If you've got a torturer, not sadistic, but a permissive torturer who controls people, controls their thinking, controls their behavior, frightens them to freaking hellfire and brimstone death. You're responsible for that God. If that's your conception, I mean, you might very well say, look, if that's what God is, I read about those gods. I read about them in the freaking Iliad.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all assholes or shallow or monstrous. And when human beings become like them, they become like Achilles and they drag Hector mercilessly around Troy. But there's something wrong with that human being, that godlike Achilles. He's exactly like those assholes.
Mm-hmm.
Who don't care about human suffering, who are indifferent to it, who cause it for a whim on a bet, right? Who sit around and laugh. And here I'm quoting from Plato's Republic, where he says a finely educated person has got a fine taste for what's been left out. And they cut out that part of the Iliad where all the gods are sitting around laughing at infidelity.
Mm.
We're just going to cut that out. Those aren't important parts. Yeah, actually, they are important parts. They're important parts of the human cry against the impersonal forces of nature, deified, right, in all these cases. And the hero, the real hero, the suffering hero of the Iliad is Achilles in the funeral games, who's mastering these deep human, natural, conflicting tendencies, but mastering it with prudence, mastering it with gifts and generosity, and somehow coming together in a great show of mourning that controls the very sorts of forces that gets us into that mourning in the first place. That's a kind of rich tradition in the West that gets absolutely, it doesn't touch the God who is the purity monster. And that God is kind of an asshole. And if you advance that God's cause and you make excuses for him, instead of, if you really believed in that God, why would you not fight against him? Just because you're too weak, right? But you'd be on the right freaking side, right? Why would you put up with that? You ought to fight against that. You ought to resist. And that thing you're resisting is not the God we worship. That is not the God of love. God is not an asshole. But we come from this apocalyptic, two-story, fire and brimstone, judgment, theodicy that no human being should accept. And yet we accepted it under pain of infidelity. Now, I could stop there. I will stop there. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to preach it, because that's actually how it gets into the narrative stream, right? It gets to your core and you identify with real stories and real people. And you say, wait, whose side am I on here? And what do I really stand for? And what am I willing to put up with? And have I put up with a lot of that? Is the tradition rightly pointed to as really having missed something? If it is judge and jury, we're going to lay out the cosmos as a stage for a holiness drama, right? And if you don't get it, if you don't come out on the wrong side, we're just going to cook you. Sorry, but that's how the world works, right? That's not a world we ought to embrace. That's not a world we ought to knuckle under. That's a world we ought to transform if we possibly could. So I'm saying, and that's an example. That's a rhetorical thread. It's more like a treble hook with a rope on it, right? Thrown from one tradition over to another, and yanking somebody up and out. I mean, the idea is there's rhetorical force involved. I just put it badly in that analogy, but it's something like that. So, and I think you'll see that theme as we proceed. You'll see that theme shot through. And when I send you that piece with the ex-evangelical movement, you'll see a lot of people reflecting on that powerful theme. There are other powerful themes too. And they're just as powerful as that one. And there's a bunch of them. And it's the very task of a craft to develop those powerful themes, to reach back in and to invite and to transform and to promise a way out. And there is a way out from that catch-22. Yes, it's a loving God, and he burns most of creation for eternity. That was Aquinas's number. Those are Aquinas's numbers. That's the world he was stuck in. And it's a great world if you want to contain the sheep. If you want to get them to do exactly what you want them to do, and you want you want to justify the divine right of kings and powerful folks to make rules, to interpret the way the world really is, to pass it down to the underlings, and to get them to behave exactly the way you want them to behave. Then you want a world just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then now you give some justification to this whole religion as control narrative, and you begin to see into it, and you begin to set people free from the codependency which is religiously induced. That's yet a second piece, or another. That's another resonance of that same movement.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many more, I think.
Mm.
And what's common on in all of this is that there is in religion, there is encapsulated in the religious, cultural, I'll call it an imperative. I don't know what the heck else to call it. It's the religious, cultural dimension of human existence. There is a boxing up. There is a controlling. There is something to be set free from in religion, and that is in the religious impulse and the cultural impulse in human beings. There is something to be set free from. Culture can be used well and it can be used poorly. It can be used to control and it can be used to set free. And so when we look back through culture, including the culture that is religious culture, we're going to find all of that stuff present there. And it's because we understand culture so poorly now, because we live in communities so poorly now, we aspire to so little that we don't pay much attention to those powerful structures. When people do pay attention to them, they are, well, I could go on and on. I mean, the Third Reich paid a lot of attention to them. And they used them to control. Anyway.
All right.
Thanks for listening to all that. So think about that. God is not an asshole.
Yeah.
So are there challenges in that old religious worldview that need to be overcome? Are there tensions in there? And are those tensions really, their time has run out? There are tensions that have not been resolved, not in 2,000 years of thought. And they are the very reasons why people are jumping ship.
Mm-hmm.
And what attracts people to religion is the love that can be captured and can be contained and can be promulgated in community. But that is not everything that's in that old system, including the Christian version of that old system or any other system. So thanks for chewing on all this with me.
Yeah.
This evening.
Yeah, I'm excited to listen to that. Is it a video?
It is. Oh, wait, you mean the maybe, but not in the version I have. The version.
Okay. Yeah. Whatever works.
I'll pop it through a text. All right. Thanks, JP.
Yeah.
Catch up maybe around a family event before the big family events later this week.
Yeah.
All right.
Sounds good.
Thanks, man.
All right. See you, Uncle Tom.